Some fires burn and are soon forgotten, but there was one fire that made an entire town fall silent. Because amid the charred ruins, there lay a Bible, untouched, unburned. Some called it coincidence, but I saw it with my own eyes. I held that book in my hands, and I swear before God, the pages were soft, as if freshly printed, no scorch marks, no scent of smoke, and the strangest thing, the book always opened to the same page. No matter who tried, it wouldn't turn. Psalm chapter 23. The Lord is my shepherd. What followed was even stranger. Dreams that whispered truths, lost souls returning to the altar. People who'd turned their backs on faith, now weeping in candlelight. I'm not telling this story to scare you. I'm telling it to remind those who've forgotten their faith. There is a word that never fades, a book no fire can consume. Welcome to Fogman Stories, a channel where true mysteries live, and the sacred meets the unexplained. If you believe there are still whispers between light and shadow, then don't forget to subscribe, and join me now for The Bible That Never Burned.
Chapter 1. The Fire. They say the Lord works in mysterious ways. I've spent over 4 decades wearing this collar, and even now, as my bones grow weary and my hands tremble with the weight of years, I still find myself stunned into silence by how true those words are. It happened on a Thursday night, the kind of southern night when the air feels heavy, like the whole world is holding its breath. The sky above Tennessee had been threatening all day, cloaked in bruised clouds that rolled and churned like something alive. And just as the sun dipped behind the hills, it began. The thunder, low and rumbling at first, like a growl in the distance, then building into a crescendo of cracks and howls that rattled the old stained glass windows of St. Mary's. St. Mary's Catholic Church had stood for nearly a century and a half in that quiet town, an unassuming wooden structure tucked between the pines. It wasn't grand by any means, but it was sacred. Generations had knelt at its worn altar rail, had whispered their sins into the dark grate of the confessional, had watched their children baptized in the stone font near the back. I had served there for most of my priesthood, and even after retirement, I'd visit when I could. That night, I had returned for a memorial mass in honor of Father Lawrence, the man who mentored me and who had passed away exactly 5 years prior. It was a quiet gathering, no more than 15 souls, mostly elderly parishioners who remembered the old days. After Mass, we had coffee in the parish hall. Some shared memories, some simply sat in silence, their eyes misty. The storm outside, at that point, had merely been a rumble. I left shortly before 9. The rain was coming in sheets by then, and the wind was picking up. I remember looking back at St. Mary's as I stepped into my car, its windows glowing softly. A beacon in the dark. I remember thinking, she still stands strong. I was halfway down the road when I saw it. A flash of lightning, so bright it lit the entire hillside, and then a sudden, terrifying explosion of orange fire. I pulled over, heart hammering. From where I stood, I could see flames licking the heavens, black smoke twisting into the storm. The church, our church, was on fire. I turned the car around, tires skidding on the slick road, and raced back. By the time I arrived, the sirens had begun wailing. The volunteer fire department was already there, young men in yellow gear, shouting over the wind, dragging hoses through the mud. But it was no use. The roof had already caved in. The steeple, so old and dry, had gone up like tinder. No one had been inside. Thank God. A few of the altar candles were still burning when we left. And we suspect a lightning strike hit the old generator that powered the auxiliary lights. There must have been a surge, and then, in a moment, everything was gone. I stood across the road in the rain, watching it burn, my collar soaked, my face hot with tears and wet with rain. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. That church had been my life, my sanctuary, and now it was ashes. It burned for hours. By dawn, the fire was out. All that remained was a skeletal frame, warped metal, and heaps of blackened wood. The cross that once hung above the altar had collapsed into the nave. The pews were nothing but charcoal. Even the stained glass windows, the ones imported from Italy in 1893, had burst into 1,000 melted fragments. And yet, in the center of it all, right where the altar used to stand, there was something. At first, I thought it was just another pile of debris. But as I drew closer, cautiously, barefoot on still warm embers, I saw it. A book, lying open, clean, intact, a Bible. The cover was black leather, still supple. The gilded edges gleamed faintly in the morning light. And its pages, they hadn't so much as curled from the heat. No smoke damage, no ash, just resting there in the ruins like it had been placed, not dropped. Open to Psalm chapter 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. I fell to my knees. Behind me, one of the firefighters let out a gasp. Another made the sign of the cross. Soon, a small group of townspeople gathered, all silent, all staring. No one dared touch it at first. There was something holy about it, something more than coincidence. I don't claim to understand miracles. I've spent my whole life serving a God who doesn't always explain himself. But standing there, in the very heart of devastation, that Bible was like a whisper in the ashes. Not long after, the press arrived. Word travels fast in a small town. By noon, there were reporters with cameras and notepads, asking questions, taking photos. Father, how do you explain this? Could it have been staged? What does it mean to you? I didn't have the words. Still don't. They took it to the local diocese for safekeeping. I asked to hold it. Just once. Before they locked it away. The moment I did, I felt it, this strange warmth. Not hot, not like fire, more like peace. A deep, unwavering peace that settled in my chest like a stone. I turned the pages, gently, no matter where I tried to go. It kept falling back to Psalm chapter 23. Again and again. The Lord is my shepherd. What followed in the weeks after was unexpected. People began returning, not just to the ruins, but to their faith. Parishioners I hadn't seen in years stopped me in the street, asked to pray. Some left letters at the site, thanking God for sparing the word. Others brought flowers, candles, small wooden crosses. I remember one man in particular, Marcus Hill. He used to sing in the choir as a teenager. before he drifted away, first from the church, then from the town itself. He'd gone to the city, chased something bigger, faster, but he came back. I found him kneeling in the ashes, tears streaking down his face, his fingers tracing the outline of the altar's foundation. I heard about the Bible. He whispered, "I don't know what I believe anymore, but that means something." He stayed. Others came too, not all for faith, some for curiosity, others for the story, but something kept happening. People who came with doubt left changed. I watched it over and over again. They'd stand there, in the soot and silence, read the words still preserved on that page, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," and they'd go quiet. It wasn't the building they grieved. It was what it meant, what it reminded them of. The weeks turned into months. We held outdoor services in the field next door. A tent, a makeshift altar, folding chairs, and still they came, rain or shine, because somehow, the fire that took St. Mary's had rekindled something else. Hope. We've begun plans to rebuild. Donations came in from other towns, other churches. A carpenter offered to donate his time. A young architect, never baptized, asked if he could help design the new space. Said he'd been moved by the story. Said he wanted to be part of something holy. And I've found myself on my knees more often than ever. Not asking why, but giving thanks. Because sometimes what looks like an ending is only the beginning of something far more eternal. He restoreth my soul. That Bible now rests under glass in the diocesan chapel. Visitors come from miles around just to see it, to pray, to wonder, and every time I visit, it's still open, still untouched by flame, still whispering that same unshakable truth. The Lord is my shepherd, even in fire, even in ruin, even now. Chapter 2. The Shepherd's Page. They allowed me to take the Bible with me. Not forever, just for a while. Bishop Kendrick had hesitated, understandably so. He worried it might attract too much attention, that it was better off under lock and glass. But I told him, gently, that I needed it, not for show, not for spectacle, but for something deeper, something I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was selfish of me, maybe not. Either way, he agreed. So, I brought it back with me to the St. Joseph Home for Retired Clergy. The modest brick building that had been my quiet refuge these last few years. I placed it on the small wooden table beside my armchair, beneath the soft light of the window that looked out onto the old oak trees. My room was simple: a crucifix above the bed, a worn rosary on the nightstand, the faint scent of cedar in the air. Nothing extraordinary, but that Bible changed everything. Even now, as I sit recalling those early nights, I find myself reaching for words that escape easy logic. The book smelled faintly of ashes. Yes, but not the acrid, heavy scent of ruin. It was gentler than that, earthy, clean, even, as if the fire that had raged all around it had somehow left behind only reverence. The pages were smooth beneath my fingertips. Too smooth, like they hadn't aged. I tried turning them, one by one. Curious. Genesis, Exodus, Psalms. But no matter where I began or ended, when I closed the book and let it rest, it would reopen, always to Psalm chapter 23. The Lord is my shepherd. At first, I thought it was a trick of gravity. Perhaps the spine had warped. I tried pressing it flat with other books, weighing it down overnight. The next morning, I found it. Psalm chapter 23. I left it closed once for nearly an entire day, tucked it between 2 volumes on my shelf. But that night, when I opened it again, Psalm chapter 23, I should have felt comforted. And I did, but there was also something else creeping in. A shiver, not of fear, but of anticipation, as if something had begun, as if something was waiting. The first night it spoke to me. It wasn't with words, it was wind, a gentle breeze through a closed window. That's how it started. I'd been reading before bed, not the Bible that time, but a letter from an old seminarian friend. Just as I turned off the lamp, a soft current brushed across my cheek. I looked up. The window was latched. The air was still. Then I heard it. Whispers. No, not quite whispers, like breath. Like someone gently exhaling words just behind my ear. I turned. Of course. No one there. But the Bible was open again. And not just open. Its page was glowing, faintly, like moonlight caught in ink. I got up, walked toward it, my legs stiff, reluctant. The room was suddenly colder. I don't mean chilled, I mean emptied. Like warmth itself had stepped out. The curtains stirred. My heart pounded. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The verse wasn't just printed, it pulsed. That night, I didn't sleep, and the dreams began. They weren't nightmares. No monsters. No screams. Just images. A man, tall, cloaked in white, standing in a barren field. Everything around him was scorched, blackened. The grass had turned to ash. The trees twisted and skeletal. But the man, he was untouched. He carried a shepherd's crook. His face I could never see, always turned from me, but there was light around him. Not the harsh light of fire. No, this was softer, like the last light before dawn. He walked slowly, deliberately. Each step left prints that glowed in the dust. He never spoke, but I could hear something. The same whispering I'd heard before. Only now it came from him. I woke gasping. The Bible was open beside me. Psalm chapter 23. Of course. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Old age does strange things. I'd seen it among my brothers at the home. Men once sharp and strong reduced to shadows of themselves. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. And the more I prayed, the more I realized I wasn't afraid. There was presence in the room. Not oppressive, not dark, but holy and ancient, as if time itself had curled up in the corner to watch. The dreams continued for nights. Each time, the shepherd moved closer. I could hear his footsteps now. Could hear the wind pick up around him. Once, I reached out in the dream, tried to touch his cloak. Just as my fingers brushed the hem, I woke up. There was soot on my hand. Actual soot. Black. Fine. Like the kind left behind after a fire. I stared at it, stunned, looked around my room. No smoke, no burnt wood, nothing. Just the Bible, resting on my table, open. Psalm chapter 23. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I feared they might think me senile. that perhaps grief over the church had finally tipped me into delusion. But something inside me knew this was real, that I wasn't imagining it, that something had survived the fire beyond the Bible. Something was calling. One evening, I brought the book into the chapel down the hall. It was a quiet place, rarely used now, save for morning prayers. I placed the Bible on the lectern, lit a candle, and sat in the last pew, alone. The candle flickered oddly, not like from a draft, but like it was reacting to something I couldn't see. I began to pray aloud. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. My voice trembled, not from age, from something deeper. As I spoke, the air around me thickened, heavier, charged. He leadeth me beside the still waters. I heard it again, the whisper, but this time, it wasn't behind me, it was inside me. He restoreth my soul. A warmth spread through my chest. Tears slipped down my cheeks. I could feel him, the shepherd, not just in my dreams. Here, now, when I opened my eyes. The candle was burning steady, bright. The Bible's page shimmered faintly. The rest of the night passed in silence. From that day on, I kept a journal. I wrote down the dreams, the scents, the sounds, the visions, every whisper, every flicker of light, and always, always, Psalm chapter 23. The shepherd was not a symbol anymore. He was real, and he was walking through the burned fields of my memory, calling. And I was following. Each night that followed deepened the mystery. The dreams became longer, more vivid. I no longer merely saw the shepherd from afar. I was walking beside him. The scorched fields seemed to stretch endlessly. But now I could see faint outlines in the distance, the ruins of a chapel, half sunk into the soil, and shadowy figures moving among the ashes. In one dream, I saw a child kneeling beside the ruined altar, weeping silently. The shepherd placed a hand on the child's shoulder, and instantly, the surroundings bloomed. Grass grew underfoot. Wildflowers burst into color, and the chapel began to rebuild itself before my eyes. I woke with tears on my pillow and the scent of lavender in the air. The next day, a nurse remarked that my room smelled like incense and wildflowers. She asked if I had sprayed something new. I hadn't. Another night, the shepherd turned his face slightly toward me, not enough to see it fully, but just enough for me to sense the compassion in his gaze. In that dream, he spoke at last, not in words I could hear, but in knowing, in understanding that pressed into my spirit like balm. You are not forgotten. The fire was not the end. It was the path. That morning, I rose with clarity I hadn't felt in years. There is something about divine silence. It doesn't oppress. It awakens. It makes room inside us for something bigger than our pain, bigger than our doubt. That's what was happening to me. That's what the shepherd was doing. He was guiding me, not away from the fire, but through it, through the valley of the shadow. In the hallway, I met Father Samuel, one of the other retired priests. He looked at me, puzzled. You look younger today, he said. I smiled. I walked with an old friend last night. I replied. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. I returned to the chapel that evening. The candle I had lit nights ago was still whole, hardly burned down. As though time bent differently in that room. As though something holy refused to let the flame die. I knelt before the Bible. Psalm chapter 23. And I whispered the words once more. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And then, with eyes full of memory and hands trembling not from age, but from awe, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Chapter 3. Ashes and Revelations. The sun had barely risen over the hills when the first of them arrived. At first, I thought they were just passing through, young people. Dusty boots, worn jeans, eyes searching but unsure. But there was something in the way they lingered outside the fence. Hands in pockets, looking not at the charred remains of St. Mary's but through them, as if hoping to see something beneath the ruin. I opened the gate and called to them. "You looking for something?" They hesitated. Then one of them, a lanky young man with auburn hair and a jacket too large for his frame, stepped forward. We heard about the Bible. His voice was cautious, like he wasn't sure whether to believe what he'd been told. Another stepped closer, a girl, maybe 22, with short cropped black hair and a tattoo of an eye on her wrist. Her arms were crossed tightly, but her voice didn't waver. They say it didn't burn, that it was just sitting there. I nodded. It's true. A murmur passed among them. There were 5 in total. None looked older than 25. They introduced themselves slowly, almost shyly, as if names carried weight they hadn't used in a while. There was Jason, the auburn-haired one. Elsie, the girl with the tattoo. Marcus, a broad-shouldered young man with tired eyes. Then Kayla and Sean, both quieter, trailing behind with unsure steps. They asked if they could help. "We just want to do something," Jason said. "We figured maybe we could help clean up." I didn't ask questions. I simply led them past the fence and handed them gloves. The site was still dangerous in places, nails sticking up from splintered beams. Soot that clung like smoke, but they moved carefully, reverently, as though aware they were stepping through sacred ground. The Bible, of course, was no longer there. It had been moved to the diocesan office for safekeeping. But I could tell they weren't disappointed. It was the idea of it that had brought them. The possibility, the wonder. They worked quietly for a while. Kayla and Sean gathered fragments of the stained glass, placing them in wooden boxes as though they were relics. Elsie swept ash from the stone floor beneath where the altar had once stood. Marcus and Jason hauled away beams and blackened wood, their shirts soaked with sweat. At midday, we sat beneath a tree for rest. I passed around bottles of water and some bread. That's when Jason spoke. "I used to come here when I was a kid," he said, staring off toward the scorched bell tower. "I stopped after high school, thought I didn't need it anymore." He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his bottle, then looked at me. But when I saw the photo of the Bible, I don't know, something hit me, like something I'd buried was waking up. He wasn't alone. One by one, they began to speak. Marcus shared next. He had a roughness about him, the kind that comes from hard years and harder choices. His voice was steady, but his eyes never lifted from the ground. "There was a night," he said, "not long ago. I almost ended it. The silence that followed was absolute." He clenched his fists. "I'd lost my job, my girl, everything. I'd driven out to the cliffs, sat there for hours. But then, I remembered a verse, one my grandmother used to say when I was small, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." His voice cracked. I hadn't thought about that in years, but it came back to me, clear, like someone whispered it into my ear. I started crying. I went home, got help. Elsie shifted beside him. I wasn't raised in the church, she said, but I did the opposite. I got into some dark stuff. Thought it gave me power, control. She lifted her sleeve, showing more tattoos, sigils, symbols I recognized from books I wish I hadn't read. I thought I was strong, but I wasn't. I was angry, lost. After I saw the story about the Bible, I couldn't sleep, kept hearing that verse, not even the full thing, just the words, "He restoreth my soul." Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know what that meant, but I wanted to. I came here, hoping he'd still hear me. "He never left you," I said gently. She looked at me, her lips trembling. "I know," she whispered. I just couldn't hear him. For a long while, no one spoke. We simply sat there, surrounded by ash and broken stone, and let the silence be enough. Later that afternoon, I brought them to the chapel at the diocesan center. I had made arrangements earlier that week, sensing this moment might come. The Bible was kept behind glass, but the bishop allowed it to be opened once a day, carefully, with gloves, when the case was unlocked, and the book laid bare before them. None of them spoke, not at first. Jason stepped forward, hesitated, then placed his gloved hand on the edge of the page. He gasped. "It's warm," he said. "It's like it's alive." Marcus was next, as his fingers brushed the text. He staggered slightly. "My heart," he murmured, "it's beating so fast." Kayla and Sean moved together. Kayla began to cry almost instantly. "I can't explain it," she sobbed. "I just feel like I'm home." And Elsie, she didn't touch it. She stood there, hands clenched, tears running freely. Then she whispered, not to us, but to him, "I'm sorry." I watched as the words on the page seemed to shimmer, just faintly, like breath on glass. "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." That evening, we returned to the ruins. They asked to light candles, 5 small flames flickering in the dark, placed where the altar had once stood. And then, without prompting, Jason began to pray, not a recited prayer, a real one, one from the heart. The others joined in. Some spoke, some wept, all opened something they hadn't dared to in years. The fire had taken so much, but somehow, from beneath the ashes, faith was growing again. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Chapel Ruins. It was nearly midnight when I returned to the ruins. I hadn't planned it. I'd gone to bed early. The kind of deep tired that settles into your bones after a long day of listening, truly listening, to others. But sometime after 11, I awoke with the distinct sense that someone had called my name. No voice, no sound, even, just a pull. I dressed in silence, taking care not to wake the others in the residence. I put on my old black coat, pulled the familiar white collar into place, and slipped the Bible beneath my arm. It felt lighter that night, though I knew its weight by heart. The air outside was still, too still for a September night. Even the cicadas seemed to be holding their breath. The path to St. Mary's was one I could walk blindfolded. I had done so hundreds of times over the decades, through rain, snow, celebration, and sorrow. But that night, the road felt different, as if the world had receded, leaving me alone in a space not quite of this one. When I reached the fence, I paused. The charred skeleton of the church stood solemn in the moonlight. Most of the debris had been cleared, but there were still scattered mounds of ash, warped beams, and fragments of scorched hymnals half buried in the soil. The foundation remained like a wound reopened, a hollow space that once held light and sacrament. I stepped inside. My footsteps crunched softly on the gravel. With each step, I whispered a prayer, not out of fear, but out of reverence. I wasn't alone. I knew that, not in a physical sense. The air carried weight, history, memory, presence. I made my way to where the altar had once stood. The ground there was mostly clean now, just cracked stone and a single scorched crucifix lying face down in the dust. I knelt, placing the Bible gently before me. I opened it, Psalm chapter 23. Of course, I read aloud. My voice echoed strangely, as if the night itself were listening. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That's when I heard it. A bell, faint, distant, yet clear as day. The kind of tone that doesn't ring, it resonates. Low, solemn, full of age. But there was no bell tower. It had collapsed in the fire. Nothing left but twisted iron and a pile of stone. I rose slowly, eyes scanning the ruins. The air had changed, colder, but not biting. Instead, it wrapped around me like a winter stole, carrying something ancient with it. A hush. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, from behind. I turned. Nothing. But I felt it. The way you feel someone standing behind you even when they haven't made a sound. That static pressure. That shift in the air. Then movement. A shimmer in the corner of my eye. A figure, white, cloaked, drifting just beyond the remains of the nave. Not walking, not floating, something in between. I did not run. Instead, I whispered again, though I walked through the valley. The figure paused. It was robed, like a priest, or perhaps a monk. I couldn't see a face, just the flowing edges of a white cassock, gently stirring despite the absence of wind. And then it vanished, not abruptly, slowly, as though fading into the stones themselves. I knelt again, not to chase it, not to question, but to pray. The Bible glowed, not a metaphor, not poetic exaggeration. A real, soft luminescence began to rise from the pages, like the reflection of candlelight on water. It pulsed with my heartbeat, with the rhythm of my breath, and the words, those familiar, beloved words, seemed to lift off the paper, not in motion, but in meaning. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. I wept, not out of fear, out of awe, because in that moment, I understood this was holy ground. Still, even in ruin, especially in ruin, St. Mary's had never truly burned down. The wood, the walls, the pews, they had perished. But the church remained, alive in memory, alive in the Word, alive in the very dust and ash where I now knelt. And someone, something, walked those ruins still, A guardian, perhaps, a soul unfinished, a saint revisiting the place of their earthly labor, or maybe the shepherd himself. I do not claim to know, but as I stood, closed the Bible, and turned to leave, I heard the bell once more. Just once, a single toll, then silence, but it was a silence filled with presence, and I walked home with peace in my chest and ashes on my shoes. Chapter 5. The Fire Within. Father Marcus arrived without fanfare. It was a gray morning, the sky dim with clouds but holding no thread of rain. He stepped from the modest sedan wearing the black clerical shirt in Roman collar that still looked too crisp on him, as if he hadn't yet broken it in. He was tall, with a sharp jaw and eyes that seemed to be constantly evaluating the world, measuring, doubting, calculating. I had heard of him, of course. A brilliant young priest, studied in Rome, fluent in 4 languages, had written essays that had stirred polite controversies in theological circles. He was known for his intellect, his logic, and, quietly, his skepticism. Miracles, to him, were poetic metaphors, sacred stories, beautiful, yes, but always symbolic. So when he came asking about the Bible that hadn't burned, I braced myself. I was sent by the diocese. He said, voice even, they want a full report. Something sober. I nodded. You'll want to see it. Then, he followed me to the diocesan archive, where the Bible was kept beneath glass. I watched as he looked at it, closely, like a scholar reading an inscription on an ancient stone. It's pristine, he admitted. Yes, truly found in the ashes. I gave a small nod. Open to Psalm chapter 23. He frowned. And it keeps returning there. It never leaves. He said nothing more that day, just took notes, but I could see something flicker in him, a hesitation, however brief. That night, he asked to borrow the Bible. I hesitated, but something in me whispered, let him. So I did. What happened to Father Marcus in the nights that followed? He would later recount to me, not easily, and not all at once, but I will tell it here as he told it to me. In pieces, in pauses, in trembling silences that said more than words could. The first night, he said, he tried to test it. He brought the Bible back to his room at the seminary guest house. He laid it on the desk and weighed it down with thick theology volumes. Then he tried to read from somewhere else, Ecclesiastes, the Gospels, anything but Psalm chapter 23. But the pages fluttered, like they had breath. He turned away. When he looked back, it was open again. Psalm chapter 23. He began to feel uneasy, not afraid, just unsettled. He dreamt that night, for the first time in years. In the dream, he was in a vast desert, not sand, but scorched earth, blackened and cracked. The sky was crimson, and the wind howled like a wounded beast. He was alone, dressed not as a priest, but in plain robes. His feet were bare, the ground was hot, every step hurt. He wandered, for what felt like hours. Then he saw a light in the distance, a figure, robed in white, holding a staff. The light did not shine from above, but from within the figure himself, a calm, pulsing radiance. He did not speak, but when Marcus tried to move toward him, The ground shifted, the light receded, always just out of reach. He awoke in sweat. The Bible was open beside him. Psalm chapter 23. He closed it, stared at it, then read it, slowly, aloud. The Lord is my shepherd. The words caught in his throat. He had preached them before, many times, at funerals, at confirmations, but never had they sounded so personal. That day, he was quiet. He skipped lunch. He skipped the meeting he had scheduled with the diocesan archivist. Instead, he sat with the book, turned its pages, tried to explain it to himself. It's trauma, he muttered, psychological suggestion, a classic case of conditioned belief response. But the words rang hollow. That night, the dream returned. The desert, the heat, the wind. But this time, the shepherd turned. He did not speak, but his eyes, oh, his eyes. Marcus said he couldn't describe them, only that they were ancient, and kind, and endlessly sad. He awoke weeping. He didn't know why. He spent the entire next day in the chapel, not praying, just sitting, watching, waiting. That evening, he read the psalm again. This time, he didn't resist it. He let it wash over him like water over stone. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. He paused there. The words echoed, and something inside him broke. Not shattered, not destroyed, just broke open, like a clay jar cracked to reveal light. He knelt on the cold stone floor and wept, not with sorrow, but with release, with recognition. He saw now that the enemy wasn't doubt. It was pride, the belief that he could understand everything, explain everything, control everything. He prayed until dawn. When I saw him the next day, he looked different, paler, perhaps, but lighter, as though some heavy weight had been peeled off his shoulders in the night. He handed the Bible back to me, but he did not speak, until I asked. Well, he smiled, softly, tiredly. I was wrong, he said. About what? He looked down at his hands. About how God speaks. He returned to Rome a few weeks later, but before he left, he offered one last reflection. Some fires, he said, don't destroy, they reveal. Chapter 6. The investigation. It was only a matter of time before the outside world took notice. By the end of October, the story had spread far beyond the quiet valleys of Tennessee. What began as a strange, hopeful whisper among townsfolk had become a front-page headline across the state. Bible survives church fire unscathed, a miracle? Then came the journalists, the scientists, the skeptics, and, inevitably, the investigators. I watched them arrive from my window, reporters with cameras slung over their shoulders, researchers with briefcases and lab kits, men in tailored suits with stiff expressions and skeptical eyes. Some came out of curiosity. Some came hunting for scandal. Others, I could tell, came looking for something they didn't even know they were missing. The diocese granted limited access to the Bible. Under strict supervision, a team of forensic analysts was allowed to conduct non-invasive testing. They brought with them an array of tools: UV light scanners, moisture detectors, chemical swabs. The testing took place inside the diocesan archives. a room usually reserved for old manuscripts and diocesan decrees. Dr. Ethan Chambers, head of the team, was a composed man in his mid-50s with thin glasses and a reputation for unearthing religious hoaxes. He wasn't cruel, just relentlessly rational. To his credit, he approached the task with respect. His first observation was one we had all made. The leather binding shows no blistering, no warping. He turned each page with gloved hands, scanning with the spectrometer. No evidence of exposure to extreme heat, no singed edges. The team tested for chemical retardants. None. They checked the ambient residue from the fire, ash, smoke particulates, carbon traces, and compared it to the pages. Somehow, despite being found in the epicenter of the blaze, the Bible bore none of it. Dr. Chambers finally leaned back and folded his arms. Scientifically speaking, this doesn't make sense. One of his younger assistants asked quietly, "Could it be divine?" Chambers didn't answer, but he didn't scoff either. The real turning point, however, didn't come from the scientists. It came from a journalist. Her name was Melissa Caraway. Young, sharp, driven. She worked for a secular online magazine known for its investigative pieces and biting wit. I admit I didn't expect much when she introduced herself, but then she asked if she could hold the Bible. I hesitated. "It's all right," she said, seeing my expression. "I'm not here to mock anything. I just want to understand." I agreed, under supervision, with gloves. She stood before the case for a moment, then reached out. The moment her fingers touched the cover, she gasped. "Are you all right?" I asked. She nodded, but tears welled in her eyes. "It's warm," she whispered. "It feels like it's breathing." Her hands trembled. She opened to Psalm chapter 23 and began reading aloud. Her voice cracked halfway through. When she finished, she stood silent for a long time. Then she looked at me. "How'd I get baptized?" That moment changed everything. Her article, published days later, wasn't what her editors expected. It wasn't snarky. It wasn't skeptical. It was raw. I held it. I felt it. I can't explain it, but I know I'm not the same. She detailed her experience, not as a conversion story, as an encounter. Her words reached people in places we'd never imagined. And soon, more came. Pilgrims, not tourists. One afternoon, a retired fireman named Carl Bennett visited the ruins. He had been one of the first responders the night of the fire. I remember it clear as day. He told me we had just started hosing down the back wall when someone shouted. The roof was caving in. We all pulled back. He stared at the space where the altar had stood. I saw it, that Bible, sitting there. I thought it was a hallucination. I even aimed the hose at it, thinking maybe it was smoldering under the cover. He shook his head, but it didn't get wet. Not a drop. The water curved around it like it didn't want to touch it. He paused. I never believed in miracles. Still don't, but that wasn't natural. Then, the investigation took a darker turn. Local police, following a series of tips, arrested a man in connection with several acts of arson across the county. Anti-religious graffiti had been found near other churches, though no prior fires had been fatal. The man's name was Thomas Reed. He was 38, unemployed, estranged from his family. He had a long record of trespassing and vandalism but had never been charged with arson until now. Evidence linked him to the fire at St. Mary's. Traces of accelerant were found near the generator. A lighter engraved with his initials was discovered in the woods behind the church. He confessed to being near the site the night of the fire. But when questioned about the Bible, he went pale. "I didn't touch it," he said. "You saw it?" the officer asked. "I saw it," Reed whispered, "sitting in the middle of the fire. Not burning. Why didn't you destroy it like the rest?" He shook his head violently. "I couldn't. I knew I couldn't. It was watching me." The officer laughed. "A book?" Reed looked him dead in the eye. "You go near it, you'll know. His trial is still pending. He's been examined for psychological stability, and while the evaluations suggest paranoia, none have declared him unfit. I don't know what the court will decide, but I know what I saw in his eyes. Not guilt, fear. The kind of fear that changes a man. The kind of fear that comes when you touch something you shouldn't, when you step across a threshold you didn't believe existed. The Bible remains under glass. We no longer try to explain it. The scientists have left. The journalists have moved on. But the faithful keep coming. Not to study it, not to prove or disprove. Just to be near it. To kneel, to whisper, to weep, and somewhere in the silence of the chapel, you can still hear it. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me." A verse once printed on a page, now written into lives. Chapter 7. Psalm of the Returning Heart. Winter melted slowly into spring. The land thawed with reluctance, the trees shaking off their slumber one hesitant bud at a time. Life returned, inch by inch, and so did the faithful. The foundation of the old church still lay bare, but now it was surrounded by the hum of hammers, the whir of saws, and the murmur of prayer. The decision to rebuild St. Mary's had not come from the diocese. It came from the people. They returned quietly at first, curious, cautious. Then came the laborers, volunteers offering their hands and hearts. Brick by brick, board by board, St. Mary's began to rise from the ashes. And something else rose with it: belief. I watched it all from the edge. My knees could no longer carry timber, but my hands still knew how to bless. So I blessed every beam, every stone, every soul that stepped onto the sacred ground. The Bible had been moved again, this time to a glass case built into the chapel's new altar. Not hidden, not idolized, but honored as a witness. It rested open, still on Psalm chapter 23. No one tried to change the page anymore. There was no need. That verse had become the heartbeat of our town. One morning in late April, I received a knock at my door. It was Elsie. She stood straighter now. Her eyes were brighter, her tattoos unchanged but somehow softened. There was a peace in her that hadn't been there before. "I'd like to be baptized," she said. My breath caught. She smiled. "On Good Shepherd Sunday," she added, "if you'd allow it." I did more than allow. I wept. Word spread quickly. On the morning of the 4th Sunday of Easter, people gathered in numbers we hadn't seen in decades. They came from every direction, some with families, some alone, some who hadn't set foot in a church in years. Folding chairs stretched across the grass. A temporary altar stood beneath the sky. The new church was not yet complete, but it didn't matter. The church, in truth, had never left. Elsie stood beside the font in a simple white dress. She shook slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of the moment. "I used to run from him," she whispered as I poured the water, "but he never stopped following me." The water touched her forehead. The sunlight broke through the clouds, and heaven rejoiced. We read Psalm chapter 23 aloud as one body. Men, women, children, some reading from memory, some from printed bulletins, some through tears. The words rose like incense. "He leadeth me beside the still waters. A gentle breeze swept across the field. He restoreth my soul." I glanced toward the altar. The Bible gleamed faintly beneath the glass, light dancing along its pages. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." The last line came like a wave, "and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full of presence, of joy, of Him. I stepped forward. "Each of us," I said, "has walked through the valley, some through shadows, some through flame, but none of us were alone." I paused, because the shepherd never left us. And for the first time in a long while, I saw it in their eyes, not fear, not doubt, but belonging. We were His, and He had called us home. Chapter 8. The Flame That Couldn't Consume. The mourning father Raymond passed. The world was quiet. He died in his sleep, in the modest little room he had lived in for over a decade. The sisters found him just after dawn, the light of the rising sun catching the edges of his worn prayer shawl. His hands were folded across his chest. A rosary rested gently in his fingers, and his lips, those lips that had whispered thousands of blessings over so many years, were still curved in the faintest smile. Peace had come like a soft breath. Word of his passing moved like a hush through the town. No sirens, no grand announcements, just a silence full of reverence. The kind of silence that made people stop what they were doing and look to the sky. He had asked for no funeral sermon, only a reading of Psalm chapter 23. And so we did, under the open sky, in the unfinished nave of the new St. Mary's. We gathered, old men who had once served as altar boys, women who had returned to faith because of his listening ear, children now grown, who had received their first sacraments from his hands. We stood where fire had once raged and read, "The Lord is my shepherd," and the wind carried the words into every corner of the earth. The night before his burial, something happened. It was late. I had gone to the chapel alone, needing a moment to speak with God, and perhaps with Him. The Bible was there, as always, resting beneath glass atop the altar. But as I entered the chapel, I stopped. The room was not empty. A soft light, not from candles, not from bulbs, shimmered around the case. I stepped closer. The Bible glowed, just faintly, but unmistakably. The same golden radiance I had once felt in His presence was now alive within the word He loved. Psalm chapter 23. Still, I knelt, and I wept, not out of sorrow, out of awe. The shepherd had come for his servant, and in doing so, had left behind a reminder. the flame could not consume. Father Raymond was laid to rest beneath the old oak tree on the eastern edge of the church grounds. His tombstone was simple, no titles, no grand epigraph, just his name, and beneath it, "Yea, though I walk through the valley." Visitors began arriving not long after. First a trickle, then a stream, then a river. They came not for spectacle, but for solace. Some came broken, others came searching, a few came angry, certain they would find nothing. But no one left unchanged. In the chapel, where the Bible remained open, healing began to happen, not in dramatic flashes, in quiet, unseen ways. A man who had not spoken to his daughter in 20 years picked up the phone and called. A woman whose hands had trembled from anxiety for a decade walked out with still fingers. A boy who had not spoken since witnessing his brother's death said his first words beside the altar. "I'm not alone. I watched it all. I recorded nothing, but I remembered everything." Father Marcus took up the ministry not with fanfare, but with a quiet strength. He no longer questioned what could not be explained. Instead, he embraced it. He preached with gentleness. He listened with his whole heart. And every Sunday, he would pause before the reading of the Gospel and recite Psalm chapter 23. Not because it was required, but because it had become the breath of the church. The Bible never turned its page, no matter who touched it, no matter how carefully it was lifted, cleaned, examined. Psalm chapter 23 remained its center. "The Lord is my shepherd." Its ink never faded, its leather never cracked, its words never dulled, and the flame that once tried to consume it, it had only revealed what fire could never destroy: faith, hope, and the presence of the shepherd, who walks with us still. Some flames purify, others destroy, but the fire that tried to consume God's word only made it shine brighter. In the heart of ruin, Psalm chapter 23 stood unscathed, not by chance, but by grace, not as a symbol of survival, but as a living page that breathed healing into the broken, a page that whispered peace into nightmares, a page that led prodigals home, a page that refused to turn because it had already turned hearts. In that psalm, the shepherd called us back, one lost sheep at a time. And we remembered, no flame can touch what is eternal. Psalm chapter 23 verse 4, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Isaiah chapter 40 verse 8, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever."